museum drawer tonight, there is a clay tablet the size of a bar of soap, covered in wedge-shaped marks. It is a complaint. A merchant named Ea Nasir sold a customer poor-quality copper, and the customer's furious letter about it survives. It has sat there for roughly 3,700 years because he was angry enough to write it down, and because in that part of the world people wrote on mud, and mud, once dry, is close to eternal. Everything we know about the first civilization on Earth reaches us that way, not in gold, in dried mud. Tonight we follow that whole story slowly, from the first cities to the coming of Persia. If you would rather listen with your screen dark, this channel is on Spotify as well, and the link is in the description below. Before we slow down, tell me where you are listening from and what the clock says there. And now, let us take the pace right down. Nothing here needs you. We have around 3,000 years to travel through, and I will go gently the whole way. If you drift off among the Sumerians and never reach the Assyrians, that is not a missed evening. That is the evening working properly. So let your head settle into the pillow. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands loosen and your jaw, which is usually holding more than you think. We are going to travel a long way tonight. Down 2 rivers, across marshes and irrigated fields and open desert into cities of mud brick with towers at their center, and out again, slowly. One thing at a time, and I will explain everything as we go. Let me start with something very small, a lump of clay. Take it in your hand. It is damp and cool and slightly gritty, dug from a riverbank, and it holds any shape you press into it. You flatten it into a pillow the size of your palm. Then you take a reed, cut from the marshes, and trim the end into a wedge, and press that wedge into the surface. Not draw. Press. Dragging a reed through wet clay tears it, but pressing leaves a clean triangular impression, wide at one end and tapering to a point. Press it several times at different angles and you have a sign. Then you leave the tablet in the sun and it hardens, and if you ever need it permanently, you put it in a fire and it becomes ceramic. That is the whole technology. And I want you to notice what it does. Papyrus rots. Parchment rots, paper burns and rots, wood rots. Almost every writing surface humanity has used decays if you leave it in the ground, which is why so much of the ancient world is silent. Clay does not. Clay survives burial indefinitely, and it survives fire particularly well, which produces one of history's stranger ironies. When a Mesopotamian city was sacked and burned, the fire baked the archives hard and preserved them. We can read those documents today precisely because somebody destroyed the building they were in. The result is that we have something like 500,000 cuneiform tablets in collections around the world, and new ones still coming out of the ground, and only a fraction have been fully published, and there are far more tablets than there are people who can read them. And what is on them is not mostly epic poetry. It is receipts, ration lists, contracts, loans, tax records, school exercises, inventories of sheep, which is better for our purposes than poetry, because it means we can look directly at how ordinary life worked in the first cities on Earth in a way we cannot for most of what came afterwards. We also have letters between kings and letters between merchants and letters from a young man at school to his mother complaining that his classmates have better clothes than he does, and could she please do something about it. That is 4,000 years ago. and it is exactly the letter you would expect. So here is the question I would like us to carry through the night. Hold it loosely. Why here? Why did the first cities, the first writing, the first codified law, the first bureaucracy, the first literature we can name an author of, all appear on this particular stretch of hot, flat, resourceless floodplain rather than somewhere more obviously blessed? Because when you look at the place, it is not obvious at all. Let me show you the land. 2 rivers rise in the mountains of what is now eastern Turkey and run southeast, roughly parallel toward the Persian Gulf. The eastern one is the Tigris, faster, deeper, and more dangerous. The western one is the Euphrates, slower, shallower, and easier to divert into canals, which is why the earliest cities cluster along it. The Greeks named the land between them Mesopotamia, which means simply between the rivers. In the north, up toward the mountains, there is enough rainfall to grow crops without irrigation. That region will become Assyria, and it is rolling greener with stone and timber available in the hills. In the south, toward the Gulf, there is essentially no rain worth the name. Summer temperatures run past 50 degrees. The land is dead flat alluvial mud laid down by the rivers over millennia. There is no stone, there is no timber, there is no metal, there is barely a pebble. What there is water in the rivers, and soil of extraordinary fertility, and enormous quantities of clay, and reeds in the marshes, and blazing sun. That is the south, and that is where it happened. Now the flooding, because it is the hinge of everything. The Egyptian Nile floods once a year, in late summer, with great regularity, and it does so gently, spreading over the fields and leaving silt behind. You can build a calendar around it. Egyptians did. The Tigris and Euphrates flood in spring from snowmelt in the Turkish mountains, and they do it violently, unpredictably, and at exactly the wrong moment after the winter grain has been sown and before it has been harvested. They also change course. On a flat plain, a river held up by its own silt will sooner or later break its banks and go somewhere else, and when it does, a city that has stood on a riverbank for 600 years is suddenly 20 miles from water and finished. This happened repeatedly, and it is why several great Mesopotamian cities are now mounds in dry desert with no river anywhere in sight. So to farm this land, you must do 2 things that are genuinely hard. You must build and maintain canals to bring water to fields the flood does not reach, and keep them dredged, because silt fills them constantly. And you must build levees and basins to hold the flood off the crops at the wrong time of year and store the water for the right one. Neither can be done by a family. Neither can be done by a village. Both require organizing several thousand people to dig every year forever, and to keep doing it when the harvest is bad and everyone is hungry, which means somebody has to have authority. Somebody has to decide who digs and who gets water first and how much everyone owes. Somebody has to keep a record. And that is where I think the answer to our question begins. Not because the land was generous, but because it was demanding in a way that was solvable only collectively. Egypt's river gave you a flood you could rely on. Mesopotamia's gave you a problem you had to organize a city to answer. But I want to be careful here, because that argument can be pushed too far, and it has been. The idea that irrigation alone produced the state is now generally regarded as too neat. The archaeology suggests cities and temples came first, and the really large-scale waterworks came after. Water was not the cause on its own. What it was, unquestionably, is a permanent reason for people to stay organized once they had started. There is one more thing about the South worth holding on to because it shaped the whole economy. That plain has fertility and nothing else. No stone for building or for tools, no metal or no timber for roof beams, no semi-precious stone for the jewelry elites everywhere want. So from the very beginning, the moment a Sumerian city wanted anything harder than mud, it had to trade for it. Cedar came down from the mountains of Lebanon. Copper came from Oman and Anatolia. Silver from Anatolia. Carnelian from the Indus Valley over 2,000 kilometers away. And lapis lazuli, that astonishing deep blue, came from a single region in what is now northern Afghanistan, and it is found in Sumerian graves in quantity. What went out in exchange was grain and wool and textiles woven in workshops employing thousands of women. So the first civilization was, from the outset, a manufacturing and trading economy embedded in a network stretching from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean. It had to be. The mud gave it no alternative. Let us go back to the beginning then and watch the villages become something else. By around 6,000 years before the Common Era, farming communities were established across the region. In the north, the Halaf culture produced painted pottery of real beauty. In the south, from around 5,500, a culture archaeologists call Ubaid spread across the marshy plain, and at a place called Eridu they built a small mud shrine. Then they rebuilt it, and rebuilt it again on the same spot, larger. Excavators there found something like 18 successive temples, stacked one on top of the other, over thousands of years, each raised on the leveled ruins of the last. That is worth pausing on, because it is the physical origin of one of the most recognizable structures in the ancient world. Mud brick buildings do not last. When one collapses, you flatten it and build on the rubble so the sacred spot rises. Do that for 2,000 years, and your temple is standing on a substantial artificial hill. Formalize that hill deliberately, face it in fired brick, add stairs, and you have a ziggurat. Around 4,000 before the Common Era, in the city of Uruk, something changed pace dramatically. Uruk grew and grew until by around 3,200 it may have held something in the region of 40 to 50,000 people inside its walls, with more in the surrounding territory. That would make it, as far as we know, the largest human settlement that had ever existed. Nobody had lived like that before. Tens of thousands of people in one place, most of them not knowing each other, most of them not related, many not farming at all, but making pots or weaving cloth or working metal or keeping accounts. That is the invention, not the buildings, the arrangement. And a settlement of that size generates a problem immediately. How do you keep track of anything? The answer, when it came, was writing, and the way it developed is one of my favorite sequences in all of human history because it is so completely unromantic. It starts with tokens. For thousands of years before writing, people across the Near East used small clay tokens in distinct shapes, each standing for a commodity, a cone for a measure of grain, a sphere for a larger measure, other shapes for jars of oil or head of livestock. If you sent goods somewhere, you sent the tokens as a record. Then someone had an idea. Seal the tokens inside a hollow clay ball so they cannot be tampered with in transit. Good, except that now you cannot see how many are inside without breaking it. So they began pressing the tokens into the outside of the ball before sealing them in, leaving an impression of the contents on the surface. And then, at some point, somebody noticed that If the impressions on the outside record the contents, you do not actually need the tokens inside at all. Flatten the ball into a tablet. Keep the marks. That is writing. It emerged as an accounting shortcut, invented by administrators trying to track deliveries of barley and sheep. And for several centuries, that is essentially all it was used for. The earliest tablets from Uruk from around 3300 before the Common Era are almost entirely economic. Quantities, commodities, and sometimes a name. There is no literature, no religion, no history. Just the temple bookkeeping of a very large town. Over the following centuries, the signs changed. Pictures became stylized, then abstracted, then reduced to combinations of wedges pressed with a reed, and the resulting script is what we call cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge-shaped. And then came the leap that made writing what it is. The early signs stood for things. A drawing of a head meant a head. That works fine for barley and sheep, and completely fails for anything else, and it fails absolutely for names. The solution is called the rebus principle, and it is the same trick a child uses drawing an eye for the word eye. If a sign for an object is read for its sound rather than its meaning, then you can spell things you cannot draw. Sumerian was well suited to this because it had a great many short words that sounded alike. Once you can write sounds, you can write anything. Names, verbs, grammar, prayers, arguments, jokes, poems. Writing crossed from being a list to being a language, and it happened in southern Iraq somewhere before 3000 before the Common Era. Now, one important qualification: cuneiform is a script, not a language, the way our alphabet is not English. It was used to write Sumerian first, then Akkadian, and later Elamite, Hittite, Hurrian, Eurasian, and Old Persian. It served the Near East for over 3,000 years, which makes it the longest used writing system in human history, and the last dated cuneiform tablet we have is an astronomical text from the 1st century of our era. Then it was forgotten entirely for about 1,800 years. And everything on those tablets was lost until European scholars cracked it in the middle of the 19th century, largely by working from that trilingual cliff inscription at Bisitun we visited on our Persian night. A word about the language itself because it is genuinely peculiar. Sumerian is a language isolate. It is not related to Akkadian, which is Semitic and a cousin of Hebrew and Arabic. It is not related to Persian or to any Indo-European language. It is not related to Turkish or to Elamite or to anything else known. It sits entirely alone with no established relatives living or dead, and people have proposed connections to a great many language families over the last century, and none of them has held up. Structurally, it works quite unlike the languages most of us speak, building words by stringing together a chain of small elements, each carrying one piece of grammatical information, so that a single Sumerian word can require a whole English clause to translate, which means that when we read Sumerian today, we are doing something slightly miraculous. There is no living descendant to check against, no related tongue to compare with. Everything we know comes from the internal evidence of the texts themselves, and above all, from the fact that Akkadian-speaking scribes who were learning Sumerian as a dead classical language made bilingual dictionaries and grammar exercises for their own students. They wrote study aids in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, and we are still using them. Learning to write it was not easy, and we know a startling amount about how it was taught because school exercise tablets survive in enormous numbers. Scribal school was called the Aduba, the tablet house. Students copied sign lists, then vocabulary, then proverbs, then literary texts, repeatedly for years. There are tablets with a teacher's model on one side and a pupil's wobbling attempt on the other. And there is a whole small genre of Sumerian texts about school life in which students are caned for being late, for talking, for sloppy handwriting, and for standing up without permission. And in one of them, a desperate boy invites his teacher home to dinner, where his father flatters the man and gives him a new garment and a ring, after which the teacher declares that the boy has become a fine scholar. The first written record of bribing a teacher is roughly 4,000 years old. By around 2900 before the Common Era, the southern plain held a dozen or more independent city-states. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, Eridu, and others. Each had walls, farmland, canals, a population in the thousands or tens of thousands, and at its heart a temple to its own patron deity. They shared a language, a script, a religion, and a culture. And they fought each other constantly, mostly over water rights and boundary land, in wars recorded on monuments in tones of enormous self-righteousness. There is a long-running border dispute between Lagash and Umma over a stretch of irrigated field that runs on and off for about 150 years, with treaties, arbitration by a third city, boundary markers set up and torn down, and repeated fighting. It is documented well enough to reconstruct in detail. The first recorded international treaty, the first recorded arbitration, and the first recorded dispute about who gets the water, all in one file. The cities also produced something that tells you how they thought about time, and it is worth a moment. The Sumerian king list is a document surviving in several copies that lists the kings of Mesopotamia in sequence, city by city, with the length of each reign, on the organizing principle that kingship itself was a single thing that descended from heaven and passed from one city to another as each fell. The early entries are not sober. The first kings are given reigns of tens of thousands of years, one of them 28,800. Then there is a flood, and after the flood, the reigns drop to lengths that are merely improbable, and eventually to plausible ones, and by the later sections the list can be checked against other evidence, and is broadly reliable. Two things about it are interesting. First, the pattern of enormously long lifespans before a flood and shorter ones afterwards is exactly the pattern in the book of Genesis, which is another of the several places where the two traditions are visibly related. Second, and more importantly, the list is not really a chronicle. It is an argument. By presenting kingship as one continuous institution that moves from city to city, it makes whoever currently holds it the legitimate heir of everyone who held it before, and it makes rival claims illegitimate by definition. Several of the dynasties it presents as consecutive were in fact contemporaries ruling at the same time in different cities. So the oldest historical document in the world is also the oldest example of history being arranged to suit the people commissioning it. And you may take whatever comfort you like from the fact that this problem is as old as the profession. What it does show unmistakably is that these people had a sense of deep time and cared about it. They knew they were living after other people. They kept records specifically so the past would not be lost, and they copied those records for 2,000 years. Let me put you inside one of these cities now, because I've been describing structures and you should stand in the street. It is a morning around 2500 before the Common Era, in a southern city on a canal off the Euphrates. You wake on the roof because in summer everybody sleeps on the roof, and you came up here at dusk when the mud brick was still radiating the day's heat, and you lay listening to a dog somewhere in the water in the canal. Now it is barely light and already warm. You go down a short stair into a house of mud brick built around a small open courtyard with rooms opening off it. The walls are thick, a mud brick house being one of the better answers to extreme heat, and inside it is cool and dim. Breakfast is barley. It is essentially always barley because barley tolerates the salty soil better than wheat does, and it comes as flatbread baked against the wall of a clay oven or as porridge. There is beer, which is thick and slightly sour and nutritious and drunk by everyone including children, and often through a straw, because the fermentation leaves solids floating on top. We know how they made it because a hymn to the beer goddess Ninkasi survives, and the hymn is also, in effect, a recipe. There are onions, garlic, chickpeas, lentils, dates, and if you are prosperous, fish from the canal or a little mutton. Dates are everywhere. The palm gives fruit, syrup, fiber, timber of a kind, and shade for the crops beneath it. You go out into a street that is narrow, unpaved, winding, and shared with donkeys. The city is a maze of them because the houses accumulated organically over centuries, and the street level rises steadily over time as rubbish and collapsed brick accumulate, which is why old city floors are below the street outside. Above everything stands the temple on its platform, and it is white or brightly colored, and it is the only thing in the city you can see from anywhere. The temple is not simply a religious building, it is the largest landowner, the largest employer, a warehouse, a bank, and the central administrative office. It owns fields worked by dependent laborers, herds of sheep, and workshops. It lends grain and silver at interest. It employs scribes, brewers, bakers, weavers, smiths, singers, and cleaners, and it feeds them from its stores. And in the middle of it, in a dark room most people never enter, is a statue of the god, which is not thought of as representing the god so much as housing him. The statue is washed, dressed, and fed twice a day with real meals, which are afterwards distributed to the staff and to the king. The religion is worth understanding because it is bleak and honest in a way later ones rarely are. There were hundreds of deities, and the important ones were forces you can see. An, the sky; Enlil, the wind and the storm; the most powerful and the least reassuring; Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and clever solutions, who is the one who likes humanity and repeatedly saves it behind the backs of the others; Inanna, later Ishtar, goddess of love and of war, the most vivid personality in the whole pantheon; Utu, the sun, who sees everything and therefore oversees justice; Nana, the moon. Human beings, in the Mesopotamian account, were created for a specific and unflattering purpose. The lesser gods were tired of digging the irrigation canals and rebelled, and so humanity was made out of clay to do that work instead so that the gods could rest. You exist to maintain the canals and feed the gods. That is your function, and there is no reward afterwards. The Mesopotamian underworld, the house of dust, is a dim place where the dead sit in the dark, eat clay, and are covered in feathers, and it is the same for everyone, king or slave, righteous or wicked. There is no judgment and no paradise. What you can hope for is a decent life here, a full stomach, children, a good name, and proper burial with offerings of food and water, because the dead depend on the living to remember them. There is a line in the Epic of Gilgamesh in which a woman running an alehouse tells the hero to stop chasing immortality and instead eat well, wash himself, enjoy his children, and hold his wife. It is one of the oldest surviving pieces of advice for how to live, and it has not improved with rewriting. That is the world. Now let us look at the things being invented in it. Before the inventions, though, stay in the street a little longer because I have shown you the temple and not the people in it. Most of the population farmed and did it hard. Barley, dates, onions, sesame for oil, and flax. The agricultural year was organized around the flood and the harvest. And there survives a Sumerian text called the Farmer's Instructions, in which a father tells his son how to do the job, how to flood a field before plowing, how to keep the oxen from being overworked, how deep to sow, when to weed, and to keep the ground level so the water spreads evenly. It is the oldest surviving agricultural manual in the world, and most of its advice is still sound. In the cities, the great industry was textiles. Wool from enormous flocks was spun and woven in workshops that employed women and children by the thousand on rations, producing cloth that went out along the trade routes as the region's main export. One Ur-3 text lists over 6,000 women in the textile operation of a single province. Women's legal position was complicated and worth stating carefully, because both the romantic and the dismissive versions are wrong. Women could own property, run businesses, lend money, and appear in court in their own names, and we have contracts and legal documents to prove it. There were women who ran taverns, which were also, in effect, the local bank and inn. There were female scribes, though not many. Priestesses of high rank, like in Hedwana, held enormous institutional power and controlled substantial estates. Marriage was contractual, negotiated between families, with a dowry that remained the woman's and passed to her children. Divorce was possible for both parties, in principle, and much easier for men in practice, and the penalties for adultery fell far more heavily on women. The general trajectory across the third and second millennia, as far as scholars can trace it, is a narrowing. The legal position of women in the later Assyrian period is notably worse than in early Sumer, including the earliest known law requiring some women to be veiled in public, which distinguished respectable married women from slaves and prostitutes, and made the veil a marker of status enforced by the state. And there was slavery throughout, though it looked different from the plantation slavery of much later periods. People became slaves by capture in war, by being sold as children in famine, and above all by debt. A man who could not pay might sell his wife or children into service for a term of years, or himself. Slaves were a minority of the workforce rather than its foundation. Most heavy labor was done by dependent free people and by corvée duty, owed to the temple or the palace. Slaves could own property, conduct business, and buy their freedom, and some did, and the law codes deal with them as a category with defined rights and disabilities, rather than as pure property. Debt was the great engine of it, and it produced one of the more remarkable institutions in Mesopotamian government. Periodically, on taking the throne or in a crisis, a king would proclaim what was called in Akkadian a masharum, which is usually translated as a restoration of justice. It canceled certain categories of debt, released people who had been sold into service for those debts, and returned forfeited land to its original holders. Not general debt forgiveness, and commercial loans between merchants were usually exempt. But the consumer debts that had swallowed smallholders were struck out, and the people held against them went home. The reasoning was practical as well as pious. A society where debt is enforced indefinitely ends up with a small class owning everything and a large class owning nothing and owing everything. And that society cannot field an army of free farmers and does not stay stable. So they reset it repeatedly. for over 1,000 years. That idea traveled, incidentally. The Jubilee described in the biblical book of Leviticus, in which debts are released and land returns to its families in the 50th year, sits in the same Near Eastern tradition. Now, the things they invented. The wheel is the one everybody knows, and it needs slight correction. Potter's wheels appear first. The idea of mounting a disc on an axle to carry loads shows up in the 4th millennium in several places, and the strongest early evidence includes Mesopotamia and Central Europe, so a confident single origin is not really available. What Mesopotamia certainly did was use wheeled vehicles early and extensively, including in warfare. The plow, drawn by oxen, including a version with a seed funnel attached so that sowing happened in the same pass as plowing. Mathematics, and here they were. Extraordinary. They used a sexagesimal system based on 60 alongside a decimal element, and you are still using it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, 60 minutes of arc in a degree. That is Mesopotamian, transmitted through Greek astronomy, and it has survived every attempt at metrication because it is genuinely convenient. 60 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. They developed place value notation, which is a profound idea. They could solve quadratic equations. There is a tablet known as Plimpton 322 listing sets of numbers that correspond to Pythagorean triples produced over 1,000 years before Pythagoras, although exactly what the tablet was for is still debated among historians of mathematics. They calculated the square root of 2 to remarkable accuracy on a small school tablet that survives. Astronomy, over centuries, developed into something formidable. They kept systematic observational records for hundreds of years, tracked the planets, predicted eclipses using observed cycles, and developed mathematical methods for describing planetary motion that Greek astronomers later took up directly. The zodiac is theirs. So for that matter is astrology, since the observations were made because celestial events were read as messages about the king and the state. Medicine had 2 branches operating side by side, one working with omens, incantations, and appeasement of spirits, and one with a practical pharmacology of plants, minerals, and animal products applied to identified symptoms. Both were consulted, sometimes for the same patient. Those 2 branches had different names and different training. The Ashipu was the exorcist who diagnosed which spirit or offense was responsible and dealt with the cause, though ASU was closer to a physician who worked with poultices, bandages, washes, and drugs. The pharmacological texts are detailed. There are hundreds of substances listed with preparations: how to boil a plant in beer, how to make a salve with fat and honey, how to bind a wound. Honey turns out to be genuinely antibacterial and was used on wounds constantly, which means they were right without knowing why. There are also diagnostic handbooks, organized by symptom, working systematically down the body, from head to foot, listing what a physician should look for and what it indicates and whether the patient will live. That structure, symptom to diagnosis to prognosis, is recognizably medical thinking. The other great intellectual industry was divination, and its scale is difficult to convey. The central premise was that the gods wrote their intentions into the world and that a trained specialist could read them. So everything was read. The commonest technique was examining the liver of a sacrificed sheep. The liver's shape and markings vary considerably between animals, and specialists mapped it into zones and cataloged what each configuration meant. There survive clay models of livers, divided into labeled sections, used for training. But it extended everywhere. The behavior of oil poured on water, the flight of birds, the shapes of smoke, the appearance of a newborn animal or child, the sudden appearance of a fox in a city, or a snake falling from a roof onto a bed, or a lizard in a particular room. Enormous omen compendia list these, thousands of entries long, in the form, if this is observed, then this will happen. It looks like superstition, and it is, and it also produced something that mattered enormously, because to do it properly, you had to observe carefully, record precisely, keep the records over generations, and compare cases to build a systematic body of reference. That is the habit of mind that produced the astronomical archives, and those archives are the reason Babylonian astronomy became genuinely predictive. They started watching the sky because they believed it was addressed to them personally. They kept watching long enough and carefully enough to work out the actual mechanics of it and to hand that to the Greeks and through them to us. That is not the only time in history that a mistaken premise pursued rigorously has produced real knowledge, but it may be the first. The 7-day week appears to originate in this region, tied to lunar quarters and to a set of days on which certain activities were considered inauspicious. There is also music, and here they did something nobody expected. We know they had lyres and harps because instruments were found in the graves at Ur and are depicted constantly. We know they had drums, reed pipes, and singers, and that temples employed musicians permanently, and that there were professional lamentation singers whose job was ritual grief. What is startling is that they had music theory. A set of tablets describes tuning a 9-stringed lyre through a sequence of named intervals in a system that produces 7 distinct tunings, each generated from the last by adjusting one string. Those are, in effect, modes, and the intervals described correspond to the ones underlying Western music, which means the heptatonic system generally credited to the Greeks was in use in Mesopotamia at least 1,000 years earlier, and from Ugarit on the Syrian coast, there is a tablet from around 1400 before the Common Era carrying a hymn with what appears to be notation written under the words interval names with numbers beside them. It is the oldest piece of notated music known anywhere. There have been several attempts to realize it as sound, and they differ considerably because the notation is compressed and assumes knowledge. The tablet does not supply, and there is genuine disagreement about whether the numbers indicate a melody, a harmony, or something else. But somewhere on the internet tonight, there are recordings of people playing their best reconstruction of a hymn written down 3,400 years ago, and even allowing for all the uncertainty. That is a remarkable thing to be able to listen to. And there is a small object I want to mention because it is everywhere and nobody thinks about it. The cylinder seal, a small stone cylinder, a few centimeters long, carved with a design in reverse, pierced so it can be worn on a cord. Roll it across wet clay, and it leaves a continuous impression. It is your signature and your legal identity. You roll it on contracts, on letters, on the clay sealing a jar or a door, so that anyone can see whether it has been opened. They are miniature works of art, and because they are hard stone, they survive by the tens of thousands, and they give us an enormous amount of our picture of Mesopotamian iconography. Now back to the story, because a man from the north is about to do something nobody has ever done. Though before we leave the third millennium, there is one excavation I want to describe because it produced the most spectacular objects to come out of Mesopotamia, and one of the most disturbing. In the 1920s, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley dug at and found what he called the Royal Cemetery, around 1,800 graves from roughly 2,600 to 2,450 before the Common Era, of which 16 were on an entirely different scale. The objects from them are astonishing. Headdresses of gold leaves and lapis and carnelian, a helmet of beaten gold worked to show a wig, hair curl by hair curl, lyres decorated with bulls' heads in gold with lapis beards, a pair of figures of a goat rearing up into a flowering tree in gold, silver, lapis, and shell, and a rectangular box about 1/2 meter long, inlaid in shell and lapis in 2 panels. One panel shows war, chariots, prisoners, a king. The other shows peace, a banquet, a musician with a lyre, and beneath it a procession of people bringing animals and goods. It is called the Standard of and nobody knows what it actually was. Then there is the other thing Woolley found. In several of the large tombs, the principal body was accompanied by other bodies. In one, over 70, attendants, soldiers with their weapons, women in full headdresses, musicians with their instruments, and grooms with oxen and carts, laid out in rows in the pit outside the burial chamber. Woolley's interpretation, which stood for most of a century, was that they had gone down willingly and taken poison from cups,